Good morning. So, this morning I have a message from Our Lady, and it's about how God uses Our Lady and how God uses messengers for his purposes. So, here goes. My children, so very many of you refuse to listen to me because I am not God, and you desire only to be instructed by God Himself. My little ones, you err greatly and place your own souls and salvation in great danger. Firstly, my children, I am but a mere creature of God like you, but nonetheless, God has given me great spiritual powers and abilities to help you. As such, to refuse my help is to refuse God's help, because it is God Himself who has sent me to help you. Secondly, my children, many of you who want to be instructed directly by God Himself, and so refuse to listen to my words through my messengers. Again, my children, you err greatly. It is not given to everyone to hear my voice or to see me, and indeed, those souls with these charisms suffer enormously. Those of you who desire to hear me, do you also desire to surrender your entire lives and suffer? How can you expect to hear me when you already refuse to listen to me? How could you be my instruments when you are opposing my instruments? My children, how can you expect God to bless your lives when you play God yourselves and refuse to acknowledge the ways of God? How can you hold your heads high and receive my Son in the Eucharist when you do all that you can to oppose him and his ways? My children, if you do not learn to surrender your hearts and lives to God and to accept his ways, then you will perish, for God's justice will not spare your hard-heartedness and disobedience. Come, my children, and take refuge in my Immaculate Heart and turn to prayer, for this is your only refuge for these times. Well, as you can see, that message this morning is a firm message, even a stern message. And I guess the main thing that comes from it is Our Lady's, seriousness, really. See, Our Lady is basically saying that God has his ways, and that God has chosen Our Lady to be our mother and to guide us for these times. And he's always been doing that anyway. When we look at the history of the church, Lourdes, Fatima, apparitions, they're, they're not a new phenomenon. And yet Our Lady goes on to say that some people refuse to listen to Our Lady because she is not God. And the first thing Our Lady is saying is that yes, you are totally right, I am not God. She says, I am but a mere creature like you, but nonetheless God has given me great spiritual powers and abilities. And so she goes on to say, to refuse her help then is to refuse God's help because God has sent her. And we're all familiar, I don't know it exactly, but we're all familiar with that parable. Sometimes the priest will say it at Mass. It's the man that's drowning and he prays to God to help him. And somebody comes along in a boat and he says, no, it's grand, it's fine, God is on his way, keep on going. Another person comes along on a raft or something, same thing, don't worry about me, God is going to help me, it's all fine. And then of course a third person comes along on something else and he says the same thing, worry not, God is on his way, keep on going, have a nice day. And then of course he drowns. And when he drowns, the first thing he does when he dies and he meets God is he says, where were you? And then God said, what do you mean, where was I? I sent a boat, I sent someone in a raft, then I sent a third person, and you refused them all and you drowned. And so Our Lady is saying the same thing. God is sending Our Lady, and when we are refusing to listen to Our Lady, for whatever reasons people have, well then we are refusing God's help. And she says that we place our souls, or people who do this, place their souls and even their salvation in great danger. And then, of course, Our Lady goes on to say that secondly, many people want to be instructed directly by God Himself. In other words, they say, well, I want to see Our Lady myself, like the visionaries in Medjugorje. I want to have interlocutions like whoever. And if God has something to tell me, well, He can tell me Himself. He doesn't need you to tell me. He doesn't need Our Lady to tell me. I don't want to be listening to some message from Mariana in Medjugorje. Why should I be listening to some message from Michael Maloney or from somebody? Let him tell me himself, type of thing. And then Our Lady says again, you err greatly. It is not given to everyone to hear my voice or to see me. Indeed, those souls with these charisms suffer enormously. And then she even puts out a challenge. She says, well, those of you who really desire to hear me, do you also desire to surrender your entire lives and to suffer? And she says, how can you expect to hear me or hear God when you already refuse to listen? How can you want to be my instruments when you're already opposing the instruments I already have? And then how can you expect God to bless your lives when you play God and when you refuse to acknowledge the ways of God? And so Our Lady is saying very clearly, it's all well and good saying, I want Jesus to talk to me. Oh, I'd love to see Our Lady like Padre Pio. Yes, but what Our Lady is saying is, would you like to have stigmatas for 50 years and to suffer enormously like Padre Pio? The same thing with being Our Lady's instrument. We might think it would be wonderful to see Our Lady like the visionaries in Medjugorje. Of course, it's a special charism. However, for any of us who has read some of their books, especially think of Mariana's book, My Heart Will Triumph, her life has been full of excruciating suffering. Do people really want that suffering? People often want just the blessings. And so she says, how, my children, can you hold your heads up high and receive my Son in the Eucharist when you do all that you can to oppose him and his ways? In other words, how can you go along saying that you love Jesus and that you love God, and at the same time you do everything and anything to ridicule Our Lady, to ridicule Medjugorje, to ridicule messages, to ridicule interlocutions, to ridicule people like me or Seamus or 1,000 other people like that? How can you say you're pleasing God? And so she says, if you do not learn to surrender your hearts and lives to God and to accept his ways, then you will perish, for God's justice will not spare your hard-heartedness and disobedience. Now that might sound very harsh at the start, but the reality is, if we look at the life of the church in the last 2,000 years, God has always been working in the same way. God has always worked through Our Lady. God has always been working as well through prophetic figures, through mystical figures. It simply is the way of God. God has always been calling us back to prayer, back to reparation, back to loving God, back to a sacramental life, back to a moral life. And so Our Lady is saying, if you do not learn to surrender your hearts, in other words, if you just turn a blind eye to all that, then you really are going to have absolutely no excuse at all on Judgment Day. And God's justice will be against you. God has given you an intelligence, he's given you a will, and if you obstinately refuse basically to surrender to God's ways, well then you're going to basically find yourself perishing. And souls do go to hell. Nowadays, some people say there's no hell or that nobody goes there. But any of us that are involved in this spiritual area, kind of mystical area, we know well that that's not the truth. We know well that an enormous amount of souls go to hell. And Our Lady has revealed that to an awful lot of visionaries. And hell and these things are extremely, extremely real. Yet nonetheless, God doesn't want anybody going there, and that's why in these times he's sending Our Lady, begging us to pray, begging us also in places like Medjugorje to go out and to be apostles of love, to reach out to those people who haven't yet experienced the love of God, to be patient with them, to pray for them, to do reparation for them. So Our Lady is basically doing everything she can to get as many souls as possible to heaven. But she's also saying quite simply, if people refuse the ways of God, well then there would be no other choice as to where they go. So finally she says, come my children and take refuge in my immaculate heart and turn to prayer, for this is your only refuge for these times. And again, Our Lady is not saying that because Our Lady is trying to be God. Come to my immaculate heart and I will save you all. She's not saying that. She's saying, come to my immaculate heart because that is where God has provided your protection for these times. It's not about Our Lady at all. It's about God, and it's about God using Our Lady. And so Our Lady is begging us, as usual, to take her seriously, to take her messages seriously, to take her messengers seriously as well, to convert, to change our lives, to change our hearts, so that as many souls as possible will go to heaven. So, on that note, let us take all that to heart and let us do our very best today to surrender our lives to Our Lady and to open our minds and hearts to the ways of God, as unusual and all as they might seem to our rational minds. Thank you for watching.